I mean, our position in regards to the exchange rate regime in Ukraine has been very clear for many years. We believe that an economy with the characteristics of the Ukrainian economy that is open, very open, both on the trade account and on the financial accounts, that is with a structure of production and a structure of exports in particular, is heavily tilted toward commodities, which present a high degree of volatility. And taking into consideration the experience in other places, Ukraine will be much, much better served by a flexible exchange rate that will allow the economy to absorb the shocks in a better way. But this has been our position for many years. We have not, you can see it's public, it's in all of our documents. Now, always the question is, how do you make the transition from a fixed exchange rate to a float? And it's never easy. And there's all this economic literature about the fear to float. And I think Ukraine is kind of like panic to float. But it's never a very popular step, especially countries that have had pegs for many, many years, because all expectations are anchored on the exchange rate. So what you need to transition from an economic point of view, you need to make a transition so that economic agents can change the way they form prices in their head and in the system. And that's why countries have had different ways. I would say the most commonly used today and the most advocated today is the schemes of inflation targeting. When you have a credible inflation targeting system, is the credible target that is set by the government, or by, depending on who the legislation put, but the credible target is what becomes the anchor. So that is what is key. That is a transition need to be made from on the formation of prices. Now, how do you do this? Obviously, no one would advocate a shift from a peg to a float that is disruptive. Certainly, no one will promote a disruptive move on this front. And you see the experience, you have a number of countries to look around. You want to look more close by, and I'm not necessarily advocating it, but you see, for example, the case of Russia, which centers the reference exchange rate to the euro and the dollar, and there's a band that has been widening over time. Other countries fix the rate to the one currency only, or put bands, and there are a number of ways on which you can implement that. Now, ideally, you implement these at times where you have appreciation pressures rather than depreciation pressures. And there's a whole set of lists on the kind of conditions in which you should do it. Now, unfortunately, what experience shows us is that many countries at the end don't really do it under these ideal conditions. What happens is that many countries are simply forced to get out of the peg. Because, as Professor Balcerowicz was saying before, if you want to have a peg, you need to have policies that are consistent with the peg. And these are very stringent policies, including sound and proper fiscal policy. You cannot have it both ways. So if you have an inconsistent policy mix, what you end up is putting extreme pressure on the peg, which you basically can defend through many ways. But the two basic ways that you defend the peg is either you start losing reserves, because you need to intervene, and there's a point where you just need to let it go because you run out of reserves. Alternatively, or in combination with, what you do is you need to mop up the liquidity in the system. And then you tighten your monetary policy in a way where there's no liquidity, obviously no one can attack your peg. But there's a downside to this. Obviously, you generate a credit crunch. So then what you start getting is the real economy being affected, both economy and employment. So if you want to have a peg, you need to have policies that are consistent. And these include a conservative fiscal policy that is consistent with the available resources, with the financing available, and not to put pressure on the peg. If you put pressure on the peg, eventually it goes. And obviously, those episodes, in most parts of the world, those are not very orderly episodes. And that's why, ideally, you do the transition in a stable environment. Otherwise, to avoid a disruptive one, you really need to have a consistent macroeconomic policy framework in place. Thanks.